Cultural heritage, be it religious, linguistic, and ethnic characteristics, knit the minorities with their identity and helps them associate with their community as distinct from the majority. The practice of first burning the books and then burning the bodies, known as cultural genocide, is often used as a method by the governments to create a culturally homogeneous state. This is the current plight of the Uyghur minority of China, which forms the central focus of this video. Lemkin coined the term genocide, which is destruction of national pattern of the oppressed, followed by the imposition of national pattern of the oppressor. It means that except when there is mass killing of a particular group, genocide does not entail immediate destruction of the members of a group, but involves a coordinated plan of action which entails disintegration and destruction of religion, culture, language, national feelings, economic existence of a group, along with violating the liberty, dignity, and lives of members belonging to such groups. The question to include cultural genocide in the Genocide Convention at all or not was resolved before the 6th Committee of the General Assembly on 25th October 1948. Pakistan placed physical, biological, and cultural genocide at the same plane, claiming that genocide can either take place by eradicating the members or by tearing down its special characteristics. In its view, physical genocide was only the means to achieve the end of cultural genocide. The pro-cultural genocide stance of Pakistan was met by several criticisms. Danish delegation found it absurd to consider mass murders and closing of libraries in the same convention, as the latter did not have the ability to shock the conscience of mankind. US expressed the view that destruction of language, culture, and religion of a group had no nexus with the concept of genocide, which is the extermination of members of a group. Surprisingly, China at that period of time argued that since cultural genocide operated below the surface, it could be more harmful than physical, as it attempts to shun the ancestral culture of the minority. Canada pointed out that religion, language, and culture should be protected in another separate draft convention falling within the framework of human rights or the rights of minorities to provide different forms of control as separate from the one outlined in the Genocide Convention. US, in agreement with Canada, argued that if the motivation is to protect the culture of the group, then freedom of speech and expression is the only right that has to be protected. Despite strong arguments for incorporating cultural genocide in the legal framework of Genocide Convention, UNGA voted 25 votes to 16 to exclude Article 3 containing it. Nonetheless, the United Nations General Assembly, with 20 ratifications, adopted the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on December 9, 1948, which came into force on January 12, 1951. But even today, Article 6 of the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court mirrors the definition of genocide as provided in the Convention. However, it is a missed opportunity for the international community to punish people for destroying, in whole or in part, of a group's cultural identity. China is often considered to be culturally homogeneous, but often inhabits numerous ethnic minorities. Xinjiang, which is China's largest administrative unit, is located along the border with 8 nations. To make the backward, ethnic, culturally modern, and to subsume the separationist demands, the CCP, with its Great Leap West rhetoric, wanted to exploit the rich resources which were lying untapped in the Xinjiang region. Point to note: according to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region Bureau of Statistics 2010, the Uyghurs, who represented 75% of population in 1984, now only account for 46% of the population, as a result of the Han Chinese migrating to Xinjiang region. In most countries, it is the immigrants who start at the bottom of the pile and struggle to raise themselves up. But in Xinjiang, it is the inhabitants who are struggling to climb the ladder. A rhetorical shift in dealing with the Uyghurs from separatism to terrorism occurred after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, where the idea of terrorism started to be conflated with Islam. The ongoing fear of Islamophobia was further taken advantage of to introduce a systematic campaign of intense cultural genocide of every aspect of the Uyghur culture through steps which are policy of detention in the so-called vocational education centers. Second, indoctrination of Uyghur children. Third, restricting Uyghur education. Policy of detention in the so-called vocational education centers. Second, indoctrination of Uyghur children. Third, restricting Uyghur education. With the anti-extremist regulation, the government legalized the setting up of vocational education centers to provide a solution to the terrorist threats for the people affected by extremist thoughts. There are many evidences which show that the region's re-education drive in the so-called vocational centers was the reason for large-scale disappearance of Muslim population. Jinping's General Secretary of CCP tour visit to China was shadowed by violence. The public remarks on the subject linked Islamic extremism to a contagious disease and an addictive drug which requires an extensive ideological cure to rewire the brains of Muslim minorities. In one of his speeches he said, "People who are captured by religious extremism, male or female, old or young, have their consciences destroyed, lose their humanity and murder without blinking an eye." In 2013, the transformation through education camp arose in tandem with the extremification work. In 2014, Shufu region prepared a 3-tiered education system where participants who failed to achieve transformation were successfully transferred to the next highest level. By the end of the year, the camp had a total of 203 sessions repairing 3515 problem persons, out of which 88% were successfully transformed. Another sophisticated transformation took place in Guljar district where 5,000 focused persons were placed in 4 categories from A to D. Category A were the strike-hard detainees subjected to 20-day training. Group B, the stubborn of thinking who were trained for 15 days. Group C had the unstable thinkers subjected to 7 days isolation, and Group D were the ones who received light influence of extremist thoughts and were put under a 5-day training period. A country called Chapchal held a 15-day fully closed style management training in 2015 where 66% minority population who were detained were involved in activities such as memorizing patriotic texts, criticizing the religious texts, and were also asked to confess their faults. Those who failed to obey these orders were subjected to harsh punishments such as solitary confinement, food deprivation, and beatings. The experiences explained above provide a backdrop for how the authorities brought the practice of cultural genocide to its logical conclusion in 2017. Rather than focusing on just focus groups, the authorities started putting every possible Uyghur Muslim in the new, remodeled, re-education facilities under the guise of providing vocational skills. A final solution to the problem was reached when CCP Secretary Cheng Guanghua was transferred to Xinjiang region in August 2016 to initiate intense social control and securitization mechanisms. The beginning of the massive detention campaign coincided with the publication of Xinjiang's de-extremification ordinance, according to which the population should adhere to the direction of Sinicizing religion, which aims at making religion more Chinese or more secular to make it sync with the socialist society. Those who showed signs of radicalization in the form of growing beard or wearing hijab, praying, studying Arabic, giving up smoking or drinking, or even fasting, or even giving their babies Islamic names were sent to these counter-terrorism training schools. The Han Chinese have often explained the process in a brutal manner. You can't uproot all the weeds hidden among the crops. You need to spray chemicals to kill them all. Re-educating these people is like spraying chemicals on the crops, and that is why it's a general re-education and not limited to a few people. The assessment of the US government is that since 2017, Chinese authorities have detained more than 2 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic members of the Muslim community in these camps. Indoctrination of Uyghur children. The strategy of CCP of cultural genocide not only affected the adult Uyghur population but also targeted the youngest Uyghur minority. Children whose parents are in detention or are receiving training or are in prison are classified as special needs category and hence are placed in centralized care. State subsidies are provided by putting these children in special children's shelters or public boarding schools, shelter houses, and orphanages where they're made to live by Han Chinese way of life. Cultural rewiring in the form of providing education of Chinese language, committing political indoctrination along with correcting their minds is also being done, as the young can easily be remodeled without them having any remnants of Uyghur cultural origin. A harrowing picture is put by one of the Han Chinese teacher who said, "These Uyghur children were in an extremely pitiful state, wearing thin clothes despite freezing December weather. The classroom was filled with an unbearable stench because the children neither washed nor changed their clothes. Children are assimilated and indoctrinated in these unprecedented centralized boarding schools in environments where they're separated from their diseased parents. This ensures that the parental influence, religious transmission, and dissemination of their culture is drastically reduced. With its aim to ensure intergenerational separation, the Chinese government funds sending Uyghur children outside China to reputed universities to help produce civil servants and teachers who are loyal to the party. So when these children returned home during their summer break, CCP ensured that they were kept silent about their parents being detained. This plan involved telling children that their parents were put in the internment camps because they were infected by the virus of Islamic radicalism and they need to be cured for their own good, and the duration of their stay in these centers would depend on the loyalty that these children showed towards the party. When asked by their relatives whether they have committed a crime, the answer received was, "It is just that their thinking has been infected by unhealthy thoughts. Freedom is only possible when this virus in their thinking is eradicated and they are in good health." Authorities realize that to destroy their culture, one needs to break their ethnic life, which is reinforced through Uyghur intellectuals who have the capability of dissemination of cultural and scientific knowledge. The Uyghur Human Rights Project highlighted that an estimate of 338 intellectuals were imprisoned and forcefully disappeared, out of which 5 custodial deaths have been confirmed. A research on 500 China scholars showed that 9% of them have been taken for tea and 26% who were conducting archival research were denied access to relevant materials. Invited for tea has become a euphemism for a warning chat where intellectuals were called to discuss their project and then asked to leave the country. Another research shows that, particularly in the fields of political science and anthropology, 70% or two-thirds of the participant observers had withdrawn in a suspicious and an unexplained manner. Less than 2% of the sample reported that their research materials were confiscated or temporarily taken to be examined by officials, archivists, or local police. The global media is made to believe that China is battling terrorism in its domestic territory. However, these pre-planned systemic policies that are revealed through various government policies and reports highlight that the minority is having its culture destroyed by Chinese government. The cycle begins with separating the already infected adult Uyghur population by putting them in vocational education centers, transferring their children to specific boarding schools to be indoctrinated into a Han Chinese way of life, and finally preventing the transmission of the Uyghur culture at the hand of researchers. The constant bloodshedding at the hands of Chinese authorities desperately requires Xinjiang to establish ethnic peace. The polarization would further increase on ethnic lines if the global community does not step up to condemn the series of gruesome acts pursued by the Chinese authorities. So the pertinent question that arises is whether there are any solutions to prevent the destruction of the culture of Uyghurs. The increase in atrocities of cultural genocide require the re-emerging of debates on the question of expanding the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the Rome Statute of ICC 1998 to make the crime of cultural genocide punishable. Though prosecution would be the most preferable option as a retribution for the cultural genocide of the Uyghur population, it is highly unlikely that they'll ever be punished. China is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, hence they can be brought before the ICC only through the referral process conducted by the UNSC. Further, Article 6 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide limits the decision to affix the jurisdiction of genocide to the territorial states, making prosecution highly unlikely. Prosecution further would never take place, considering the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, which means that one cannot be prosecuted for a crime which was not punishable at the time when the crime was committed. China could also be forced to abide by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious and Linguistic Minorities, which provides that persons belonging to minorities have the right to establish and maintain, without any discrimination, free and peaceful contacts with other members of their group and with persons belonging to other minorities, as well as contacts across frontiers with citizens of other states to whom they are related by national or ethnic, religious or linguistic ties, and end the practice of punishing the Uyghurs for their ethnic or religious affiliation. Global actors should directly call out China for carrying out human rights abuses. For example, US House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Bill 2019. The bill, on account of China's treatment of the Uyghurs, empowers the president to impose sanctions, which includes restricting the imports and exports between the two countries. This will act as an incentive for China to terminate the gruesome acts meted out towards the Uyghurs, as loss of trade with the US will hinder the economic growth of the country. 35. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China, adopted in 1982, clearly states that citizens of the People's Republic of China enjoy freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association, of procession, and of demonstration. For 28 long years, this article has not been honored. This kind of false democracy of acknowledging in principle while negating in concrete has become a scandal in the history of world democracy. Restructuring the state system is the solution of an ethnically divided society, which involves power sharing, or as Arden Liphart would call it, consociational democracy. This involves a democratic representation of all the members of the communal group, so that the members have the autonomy to run their own internal affairs. A.H. Feller, General Legal Counsel for the UN, declared in 1949 that the trouble with international law is not that it isn't law, but that there isn't enough of it. Not only the lack of an internationally accepted definition of cultural genocide, but also the absence of an international criminal prosecution for those guilty of practicing and implementing the policies of cultural genocide shows the lacuna in the international legal framework in relation to protection of minorities. China's strong position in the international front further makes criminal prosecution highly unlikely. Thus, the fate of Uyghurs rests on creative legislation and political will of the trading partners of China. Thus, the only conclusion that must be drawn is that the near extinction of Uyghurs should not remain a mere cautionary tale, but must be a tale that prompted legislative change and thereby fill the void that the victims of cultural genocide have been longing to be fulfilled.
Hundreds of thousands of people are held in these camps across Xinjiang. They're held there without sentence, without even charge, and they will be there for at least a year before they're released. That doesn't. They will be in those camps at least 1 year.
The document, so-called document you're talking about, is a pure fabrications. Don't listen to fake news. Don't listen to fabrications.